This is video number 3 in the series on the respiratory system. So here are our learning objectives. We want to describe in more detail the alveoli, the overall function of it, as well as the presence of these elastic fibers, the overall histology of it. We want to look at these type 1, type 2 alveolar cells. So learning objectives 1 through 4 are all looking at the alveoli itself. Number 5 is describing surface tension also within the alveolus, as well as the role of this thing called surfactant, which ties into learning objective number 4. So let's get into it. So remember that this is your lung. If I didn't mention before, here it is. There's 3 lobes on the right side, 2 lobes on the left side. There's really no big functional significance to that for our purposes. But in any case, anatomically, there are 3 lobes to the right lung and 2 lobes to the left. So if we zoom in on the lungs, keep in mind that what we said before is that the lung tissue itself is really a whole bunch of these alveoli. And the way these things looked is that you've got these airways, these bronchioles coming in, and at the tail ends, what you have are all these little tiny, and previously I described them as balloons, so bubbles or balloons, and these things are the alveoli. And again, these are the exchange surfaces. This is where gas exchange is going to occur. So if you really were to kind of zoom out on this thing and kind of squint at it, what you'd see is that the whole thing, all this purpleness that you see to the lungs, all this stuff right over here, all this kind of grayish looking purpleness that you see are really nothing but a whole bunch of these balloons kind of amassed together. Of course, there's airways that need to get there, but the bulk of it in terms of kind of volume are really these balloons. And these are the alveoli. So if we zoom in just a little bit more, we see something like this. Now what we're seeing it almost looks like a cluster of grapes. And when you look at this cluster of grapes, again, each grape here would be an alveolus. And if you look a little bit more carefully, you see it's surrounded by all these little red mesh-like networks. Well, what are these red mesh-like networks? Those are capillaries. So why would you need capillaries there? And where are they coming from? Well, those are capillaries of the pulmonary circuit. If you remember, the pulmonary trunk leaves the right ventricle, splits off to the pulmonary arteries, and eventually it's going to reach the lungs, and from there it needs to turn into capillaries so exchange can occur. And at this point, what happens at these capillaries? This is where I pick up oxygen from the lungs, and it's where I dump off carbon dioxide. Okay, so if you ask the questions, what happens if capillaries break down? Let's say we snap our fingers and all these capillaries disappear. Well, then, in principle, what you might imagine is that let's say you've got plenty of air coming in, plenty of oxygen is coming into the lungs, but if you don't have capillaries to dump that oxygen into, effectively, what are you doing? You're messing up that very first exchange. If you go back to this slide that we looked at before, exchange number 1 just isn't happening because where is oxygen dumping into? Yeah, the bloods, but now more specifically, it's dumping into those capillaries which are wrapping around the alveoli. And if there are no capillaries there, there's nowhere for oxygen to go. So that first, sorry, did I say exchange number 1 is compromised? Let me take that back. It's not exchange number 1. It's exchange number 2 that's compromised if the capillaries aren't there. One more time, let me clear that up. Exchange number 2 is the one that's compromised if you don't have capillaries, because now oxygen cannot get into the capillaries since there are no capillaries in this kind of invented scenario. Okay. So the other thing that you'll notice here is that you've got these yellow fibers, and these yellow fibers are elastic fibers. Now, this is really, really important, and it'll make more and more sense as we go along. But what I want you to imagine, and actually you don't have to imagine it, when you think of a balloon, if you blow up a balloon, let's say you're pinching I don't even know what you would call it, the part that you blow into, right? You blow that thing up and you're pinching it, so now air can't get out. But if you release that, what happens? Air gets pushed out. We've all done that before. Well, why is that happening? It's happening because the walls of the balloon have some elasticity to it, and that recoil that happens pushes that air back out. What I need you to see is that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about how do we end up inflating the lungs? How do we breathe in? And what we'll see later is we'll see that when we open up the chest real big, air naturally flows in. Let me say it differently. When you open up the chest real big, you create a pressure gradient so that air goes from high pressure to low pressure environment. But the next question then becomes, well, how do we breathe out? And really what we do is we just allow the chest to kind of bounce back to where it normally was. And part of that includes the lungs themselves. When you allow the lungs to kind of bounce back to where they were, it's because of the elastic fibers. So these elastic fibers are really going to be one of the primary things that makes you breathe out, that makes you expire. Again, we'll talk more about that. I'll remind you of that when we look more specifically at the details of the thoracic cavity. But what I want you to see is that what happens if the elastic fibers break down? If that's the problem, then really you're going to have a hard time breathing out. Here's another look. Again, this is just another look at the alveoli. And again, you're going to see some capillaries around them. You're going to see some elastic fibers around them. And so what we see now, we see two different types of cells at the alveoli. We see type 1 cells, and we see type 2 cells. Now, what are these things? Alveolar macrophages. All I want to say is that, yeah, you got some immune cells in there to gobble up stuff. Remember how I said that those ciliated epithelium of the trachea are really important so that debris and weird funky stuff doesn't make its way down? Well, sometimes it does. And when it does, we need to clean that up. And if we're going to clean it up, we need some kind of resident cells to gobble up that junk. And those are going to be these alveolar macrophages. Okay, these are going to be your first line of immune defense. At the lungs themselves. I wouldn't say first line at the respiratory system as a whole, because we've got immune cells up in the mouth and nasal cavity and things like that. But within the lungs themselves, it's our first line of defense, these alveolar macrophages. All right, so what we're seeing now, we see these type 1 and type 2 cells. So let's explain a little bit more about them. I'm going to jump to this slide. The type 1 cells themselves are the regular alveolar cells. Okay, they're the regular alveolar cells, and these are the ones in purple all over the place here. And these are the ones that are responsible for gas exchange. It's made up of simple squamous epithelial tissue, and that simple squamous epithelium, remember, is flattened and it's a single layer, and these allow for gas exchange to occur. Those are the type 1 cells. Then what do type 2 cells do? What type 2 cells do is they secrete this thing called surfactant. So before I get into surfactant, I need to show you one more slide talking about diffusion of gases. But just to briefly identify, type 1 cells allow gas exchange to occur. Type 2 cells produce this thing called surfactant. Okay. Now let's go back here. So remember again, these are the type 1 cells that allow for good old straight, just gas exchange to occur. In this particular artist, these two guys over here, these are all examples of type 2 cells which produce surfactant. So what I want to show you is this. Now, what are we looking at? Where are we? We're looking at the alveolus right over here. And these are my type 1 alveolar cells, again, which are simple squamous epithelium. These are simple squamous epithelium. And again, these are my endothelial cells, which are also made of simple squamous epithelium. And this is the capillary. So there's a blood vessel going right through, a blood cell going right through. Remember that this red blood cell has a whole bunch of oxygen. So what wants to happen? Well, really what wants to happen is that in this scenario, what we have is, let's make these little dots oxygen. You got a whole bunch of these littered on the inside of this red blood cell. And what we need to see is that oxygen needs to go from here into here, right? It needs to diffuse from here into here. Now, what I want you to imagine then is that, here, let me bring this one back. So you know the way things are going to diffuse. They're going to diffuse from right to left. If this wall were really, really, really thick, we've addressed this before, then you can imagine how this gas would have a heck of a time trying to diffuse through a massively thick wall. But when it's a thin wall, when it's simple squamous epithelium on both ends, on the endothelial end of blood vessels as well as on the alveolar wall itself, then it becomes much easier for these oxygen molecules to diffuse from the blood vessel into the alveolus. Okay, so the fact that these are simple squamous epithelium is pretty important because you don't want a very thick wall. All right, so now with that said, what we need to do is move into this idea of surfactant. Just to see where we're at, we described the overall function of the alveoli. This is where gas exchange occurs. What do elastic fibers do? They allow for you to breathe out. Again, more on that to come. The alveoli are made up of simple squamous epithelium, and we care because if they weren't, let's say it's stratified squamous epithelium, if it's many cell layers thick, then gas just wouldn't diffuse. We talked about the difference briefly of type 1 and type 2 alveolar cells, type 1 being the exchange cells themselves, the primary cell of the alveoli, and type 2 cells producing this thing called surfactant. And now that is what we need to get into. Surfactant is there to deal with surface tension. So in order to understand surfactant, we're going to have to understand surface tension. Okay. Surface tension you guys have heard of somewhere along the way, whether in bio 101 or high school biology or bio 141, somewhere you've heard of surface tension. What is it? Surface tension is simply when water molecules get attracted to one another through hydrogen bonds. So again, what we have here is a water molecule, right? H2O, 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 so on and so forth. And you know that hydrogen bonds are formed from those partial negative charges on the oxygen atom to the partial positive charge on the hydrogen atom. These are hydrogen bonds, and those bonds are very weak. In many cases, they're very transient, but they are there, and it's enough tension for, let's say, it's a tiny little bug to walk on the surface of water. It's not enough to drop in a penny, but meaning it's not enough tension here to hold up a penny, but it may be enough tension here to hold like a little mosquito or something like that sitting on the water. So these are hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds pull these water molecules close together, and therefore they create this tense surface. This is surface tension. Now, what's the point here with the lungs? The point here with the lungs is to say that what we're looking at here is we're looking at the alveoli. Now imagine that this thing is the alveoli and it's completely wet on the inside just because we've got water all over the place. What that means is water has a tendency to be attracted to other water molecules through these hydrogen bonds. So let me blow that up a little bit. I wrote here surface tension pulls on the alveoli. Let me show you what that looks like. I want you to imagine a big balloon here again. There's your big balloon. The thing in kind of weird blue, light blue, whatever color that is the alveolar wall. That is the alveolus. It's a single balloon. And these little blue dots that I drew all up in here, these are all water molecules, just like you saw here, but now I'm just representing them as a solid blue dot. What I want you to see is that all these water molecules are attracted to each other. So what I didn't draw in, and let me just do that right now on the video, is I will say that these water molecules are attracted to each other laterally this way, okay? And so you can imagine a whole bunch of bidirectional arrows pointing every which way so that these water molecules are, you get my meaning. All these water molecules are all attracted to each other. But the other thing is that this water molecule over here is also attracted to this water molecule over here. This water molecule right over here is attracted to this guy over here, so on and so forth, right? All the way around. So what you want to imagine then is that what happens to this bubble, this wet bubble on the inside? It's going to collapse. These arrows all pull things inwards. What will happen because of surface tension? It'll force this thing to collapse. If that sounds crazy to you, you actually already know this. Look, when there's a lot of moisture running around in the air and it's very, very humid outside, then you can picture all these little blue dots just kind of scattered diffusely across this area. So what you might imagine is something like this. Let's say this is the air out there. It's really thick and muggy and humid, and what that means is there's water all up in the air everywhere. That's what humidity is, right? And now what ends up happening, let's say it's about to rain and it's getting ready, and what you'll see is that all these water molecules become attracted to one another and they all kind of smush in and coalesce. And when they smush in and coalesce, what does that mean? Your raindrop. Now you have your raindrop because all these things coalesce together to merge together. And really, what is your raindrop? It's a whole bunch of water molecules. Oops, I can't make that work. Anyway, a whole bunch of water molecules just kind of laid up, coalesced together, aggregated to form this raindrop. So what's holding that raindrop together? It's surface tension. It's the attraction one water molecule feels for another water molecule. Okay, so now if you have that, if you understand that, you'll understand that now here, when I have this on the inner surface of my balloon, it's really pulling my balloon to collapse. Intuitively, I think you feel that we don't want that to occur. So what we might imagine is this. There's my alveoli. Here's all my water molecules on the inside. All these things drag inward because it wants to essentially form a raindrop, so to speak, right? It wants to be coalesced with other water molecules. And that will lead to a collapse of my alveolus. Obviously, that's not okay. So what we do, we have these type 2 cells that secrete a chemical called surfactant. And what surfactant does, here's surfactant represented by these little kind of orange, yellow looking circles. And what those do, they basically disrupt the hydrogen bonds. And when you disrupt those hydrogen bonds, you reduce the tendency of one water molecule to be attracted to another. Therefore, you reduce the tendency for this lung to collapse. Okay? So you all produce surfactant on a daily basis. I don't remember in my head. It's in your textbook at what age gestationally surfactant becomes produced. But gestationally for premature babies at a certain point, If they are born before their own ability to generate surfactant is kind of matured, then this becomes a point of concern, and there's certain types of medical intervention that need to be implemented so that their lungs do not collapse. And again, through the miracle of modern medicine, it's typically not a big deal because in developed areas they have the technology and the tools, etc., to deal with that, but it always is a concern because surfactant, again, is produced at a certain point gestationally. Okay. All right, so we have described now the function of alveoli. We looked at all these things. Defined surface tension is the attraction that one water molecule feels for another water molecule through these hydrogen bonds. Why should we care? We care because if it's left unaddressed, then the lungs are going to have a strong tendency to collapse. What is the role of surfactant? The role of surfactant is to reduce or eliminate surface tension within the lungs. And these are produced by type 2 alveolar cells. All right, that'll wrap it up for video number 3.